Chicago woke to a bitter cold on the morning of February 14th, 1929. The streets were blanketed in fresh snow, the kind that muffle footsteps and swallowed secrets. The city, a battleground of bootleggers, gangsters, and corruption, stirred restlessly beneath its frozen surface. At 2122 North Clark Street, in the heart of Lincoln Park, a quiet unease settled over the SMC Cartage Company garage. Inside, 7 men, all members of the North Side Gang, huddled against the chill, rubbing their hands and stamping their feet as they waited. Their leader, George Bugs Moran, was expected any minute. They were expecting a business deal, an incoming shipment of Canadian whiskey. Then, the moment that would stain history arrived. Screeching tires, the slam of car doors, boots crunching against the snow. A group of men strode into the garage, 2 dressed as police officers, 3 others in civilian clothes. The gangsters barely had time to react before they were ordered to line up against the brick wall. They had seen raids before. This was routine. No one panicked. No one reached for a gun. Then the air exploded. The deafening roar of Tommy guns filled the small garage, the staccato bursts reverberating off the walls. The men jerked violently as bullets ripped through their backs, tore into their flesh, and shattered their bones. The acrid stench of gunpowder mixed with the metallic scent of blood. By the time the gunfire ceased, the 7 bodies lay slumped and lifeless, crumpled like discarded marionettes. Blood pooled, steaming in the cold air. Outside, the fake cops casually strolled back to the Ware car, climbing in as if nothing had happened. When the real police arrived, they were greeted by a scene of pure carnage, a massacre so brutal, so methodical, that even hardened detectives stood frozen in disbelief. The snow, once pristine, was now splattered with crimson. The only question that remained, who had orchestrated this execution? And was the man who had built an empire on crime, Al Capone himself, truly behind it? The 1920s were supposed to be an era of progress, prosperity, and change. But in Chicago, it was a decade ruled by booze, bullets, and bloodshed. The Prohibition Act, 1920 to 1933, was meant to rid America of alcohol, but instead, it created a black market so vast and lucrative that criminals became kings of the city. Illegal liquor flowed like water, sold in hidden speakeasies, smuggled in from Canada and the Caribbean, and transported in trucks with bribes stuffed under the driver's seat. Business was booming, but it was a business soaked in violence and betrayal. 2 factions stood at the top of this empire of corruption. The North Side Gang, the victims. At the heart of the St. Valentine's Day, Massacre lay the North Side Gang, led by the tough and volatile George Bugs Moran. He was a brash, impulsive street fighter, a man who had climbed the ranks with his fists before taking control of a powerful criminal syndicate. Moran's North Side Gang specialized in bootlegging, smuggling, distributing, and selling illegal liquor, gambling dens, controlling underground casinos across Chicago, extortion, forcing protection payments from local businesses. But there was one major flaw in Moran's operation: recklessness. Unlike his biggest rival, Al Capone, Moran lacked discipline and strategy. His men were rowdy and unpredictable, making him a dangerous but messy crime boss. This sloppiness would cost him dearly. If Bugs Moran was a street brawler, then Al Capone was a chess player. Nicknamed Scarface, Capone was a ruthless businessman who knew that real power wasn't just about pulling a trigger, it was about owning the system itself. Capone had turned the Chicago outfit into a well-oiled criminal machine, one that didn't just operate outside the law, it bought the law. Police on payroll, many officers, detectives, and even judges were bribed or threatened into compliance. Political protection. Capone had city officials in his pocket, ensuring the police looked the other way. Tactical assassinations. Unlike Moran, Capone didn't start bar fights, he planned elaborate executions. Capone's organization was run like a corporation of crime, and in Chicago, he was the CEO. The rivalry between Capone and Moran was more than a simple turf war. It was a battle for the soul of Chicago. Capone ran the South Side, while Moran controlled the North Side. Their gangs clashed constantly, leaving streets littered with bodies. But things turned personal in 1928, when Capone's top hitman, Jack Machine Gun McGurn, was nearly assassinated on Moran's orders. McGurn was Capone's most loyal enforcer, the man responsible for eliminating many of Capone's enemies. When Moran's men tried to gun him down outside a club, it wasn't just an attack on McGurn, it was an attack on Capone's reputation. For a man like Al Capone, revenge wasn't just necessary, it was a statement. But Capone didn't just want to kill Moran. He wanted to send a message so brutal, so unforgettable, that no one would ever dare challenge him again. And so, in the months leading up to Valentine's Day, 1929, Capone and McGurn began planning the most infamous execution in organized crime history. February 14th, 1929. The trap is set. The plan was meticulously designed, cold, and calculated. Al Capone, known for never getting his hands dirty, made sure to be hundreds of miles away when the blood would spill. He spent the morning in sunny Florida, leisurely having breakfast at his Palm Island estate, his alibi airtight. Back in Chicago, Jack Machine Gun McGurn was pulling the strings. His men had spent weeks studying Bugs Moran's movements, tracking when and where his gang gathered. A trap was set, one too perfect for them to escape. The bait? A shipment of high-quality Canadian whiskey, an offer too good for Moran to refuse. He and his top men were told to meet at the SMC Carnage Company garage at 10:30 a.m., where the liquor would arrive. McGurn had orchestrated every detail, but fate had its own plans. That morning, the men of the North Side gang filed into the garage, waiting for the supposed delivery. The atmosphere was tense, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. They had done this before. Outside, Moran was running late. By sheer coincidence, he and one of his men arrived just as the killers approached. From a distance, Moran saw two uniformed police officers and three men in civilian clothing step out of a black Cadillac sedan. Assuming it was a police raid, Moran quickly ducked into a nearby coffee shop, deciding to wait it out. He had no idea that his entire gang was about to be wiped out. Inside the garage, the gangsters, Frank and Peter Gusenberg, Adam Heyer, Reinhard Schwimmer, Albert Kachalek, John May, and James Clark stood together, confused but not alarmed. They had no reason to resist. After all, it was just the cops. The officers barked orders, telling them to face the brick wall with their hands raised. There was no warning, no last words, no chance to fight back. In a sudden eruption of gunfire, the garage became a killing field. The deafening roar of two Thompson submachine guns, a 12-gauge shotgun, and a .45 caliber pistol echoed through the walls. Bullet casings clinked onto the cold concrete floor, mixing with the blood that splattered in thick crimson streaks. The victims convulsed violently as the bullets shredded through their bodies, chests torn open, skulls obliterated, limbs jerking as the relentless firepower carved them apart. Some died instantly, their faces unrecognizable. Others twitched in agony, their bodies riddled with so many holes that the executioners kept shooting long after they were dead. One final shotgun blast, delivered at point-blank range, made sure no one walked away. Silence. The gunmen lowered their weapons. Blood pooled on the cold cement floor, seeping into the cracks. Then came the most chilling part of the plan, the escape. Instead of rushing out, the fake cops stayed in character. They calmly led the two men in civilian clothes out with their hands behind their backs, pretending to make an arrest. Neighbors, startled by the gunfire, peeked through their windows, but all they saw was what looked like a routine police raid. Within minutes, the killers were gone. They left no fingerprints, no shell casings that could be traced, nothing that pointed directly to Capone or McGurn. It was the perfect crime, or so they thought. The first officers on the scene were unprepared for what they found. Bodies lay motionless, twisted in unnatural positions. Blood splattered the brick walls in dark streaks. The garage, which had been quiet just moments before, now reeked of gunpowder, death, and iron-rich blood. One officer vomited in the alley. Another stood frozen, whispering, "What the hell happened here?" 7 men, all once powerful, now just corpses, lay in the wreckage of a war they had lost. But one of them was still alive. Frank Gusenberg, despite being shot 14 times, was still breathing when officers found him. His hands clutched his stomach, blood gushing between his fingers, his body racked with pain. The officers rushed to him, desperate to find out what had happened. "Who shot you?" one detective demanded. Gusenberg lifted his head slightly, coughed up a mouthful of blood, and with his last ounces of strength whispered, "Nobody shot me." Then he collapsed, succumbing to his wounds. Even on the brink of death, he had upheld the gangster code of silence. The massacre was unlike anything Chicago had ever seen. The sheer brutality, the precision of the attack, and the mockery of law enforcement made headlines across the country. The newspapers sensationalized every detail. Blood flows on Valentine's Day, Chicago's deadliest hit. Gangland execution, 7 men slaughtered in raid. Who ordered the hit? All eyes on Capone. Even the toughest mobsters were shaken. The message was clear. Al Capone was untouchable, unstoppable, and willing to do whatever it took to stay on top. But despite the horror, the evidence, and the whispers, no one could prove Capone was behind it. The killers were ghosts, their identities never officially confirmed. And Bugs Moran, he had unknowingly escaped death, but his power was gone. The North Side gang crumbled, and Moran fled Chicago, defeated. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre had forever changed the landscape of organized crime, turning Capone into the undisputed king of Chicago, for now. But even kings fall eventually. The massacre was over, but the real battle had just begun. The battle for justice, power, and the truth. Chicago police arrived to one of the most gruesome crime scenes they had ever encountered. 7 men lay bullet-ridden, their bodies mangled beyond recognition. It wasn't just a hit. It was a statement, a declaration of war. The obvious suspects? Al Capone and Jack "Machine Gun" McGurn. Capone's name was on everyone's lips, but the evidence wasn't. When detectives attempted to place him at the center of the massacre, they hit an immediate roadblock. Capone had an airtight alibi. He was in Miami, Florida, hundreds of miles away from Chicago. He had spent the morning relaxing at his Palm Island estate, making sure he was seen by the right people. McGurn, the prime suspect, also had an alibi. He was at a hotel with his girlfriend, Louise Rolfe, who later became infamously known as the Blonde Alibi. With both masterminds accounted for, the police were stuck. The public demanded answers, and the press pushed the police for arrests. But with no fingerprints, no murder weapon, and no eyewitnesses willing to speak, the case became a ghost investigation. The killers had disappeared into the wind, just as planned. The biggest clue? The uniforms. Multiple witnesses had reported seeing police officers entering the garage just before the massacre. But when the real police arrived, they quickly realized no official unit had been assigned to raid the North Side gang that day. The killers had used stolen or fake police uniforms. They had even used a police car likely borrowed from corrupt officers who were on Capone's payroll. The deception was so flawless that no one questioned the arrest of the North Side gangsters until the bullets started flying. But the key question remained: who were the gunmen? Some theories emerged. Theory 1, Capone's men in disguise. The most accepted theory was that Jack McGurn had orchestrated the hit using his best men, dressed as cops. This would explain why the gangsters complied without a fight. It would also explain why no one resisted or pulled a gun. They believed they were being arrested, not executed. Theory 2, corrupt cops were involved. Some suspected that real law enforcement officers had taken part in the killings. Given Capone's deep political connections, it wasn't impossible that a few dirty cops had helped plan and execute the hit. Theory 3, a rival gang set up Capone. Could someone have used Capone's signature brutality against him? Some whispered that Bugs Moran himself had survived for a reason, that the massacre was actually a setup to frame Capone and turn public opinion against him. Theories swirled, but without solid proof, the case remained unsolved. Even with no arrests, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre became one of the most infamous crimes in U.S. history. But, in the absence of justice, speculation ran wild. Theory 1, an inside job. Some believed that one of Moran's own men had sold them out, tipping off Capone's crew about the meeting. Was it revenge? A double cross? A police informant looking for a payday? Theory 2, a smear campaign against Capone. Capone had always been careful, avoiding unnecessary violence that could bring federal attention. Did someone else orchestrate the hit, letting Capone take the blame? Theory 3, law enforcement's silent approval. It's no secret that Capone had politicians and police on his payroll. Could this have been a coordinated attack with law enforcement's silent blessing? After all, not one suspect was ever charged. Despite national outrage and public pressure, the investigation hit a dead end. Capone laughed off the accusations, mocking the police's inability to pin the crime on him. McGurn was eventually arrested, but not for murder. Instead, he was charged with violating the Mann Act, a law against transporting women across state lines for immoral purposes. His blonde alibi, Louise Rolfe, testified that they were together during the massacre, and he walked free. Years later, McGurn met a bloody end of his own, gunned down in a bowling alley on Valentine's Day 1936, exactly 7 years after the massacre. As for Capone, his luck eventually ran out, but not because of the massacre. The government finally found a way to bring him down, not for murder, but for tax evasion. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre remained one of the most shocking and unsolved crimes in American history. A massacre without justice, without closure, and without a single conviction. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre sent shockwaves through Chicago and beyond. The sheer brutality, the execution-style murders, and the eerie precision of the crime made it impossible to ignore. The public had always been fascinated by gangsters, often viewing them as larger-than-life anti-heroes, but this was different. This wasn't just a turf war. This was a bloodbath. Even the most hardened criminals were disturbed by the cold, ruthless efficiency of the attack. If someone like Bugs Moran, one of the most feared gangsters in Chicago, could be hunted like an animal, who was next? And so, the massacre changed everything. The public turned against Al Capone. The newspapers, once obsessed with his flamboyant lifestyle, now branded him a monster. J. Edgar Hoover and the federal government took notice. Before the massacre, local police were either too scared or too corrupt to touch Capone. But this massacre was too public, too shocking, too violent to be ignored. The FBI made Capone their #1 target. J. Edgar Hoover, the new head of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, saw this as an opportunity to make an example of organized crime. He didn't care if Capone had been in Miami when the massacre happened. Capone had to go. Capone's arrest, but not for murder. For years, Capone had evaded every charge thrown at him. Witnesses were either paid off, too scared to testify, or turned up dead. But if the government couldn't get him for murder, they would get him for money. The irony? Capone wasn't taken down by guns, but by accountants. In 1931, the federal government finally got what they needed, solid proof that Capone had evaded taxes on millions of dollars. The trial was swift. Capone was sentenced to 11 years in prison. At first, Capone was sent to Cook County Jail, where he bribed guards for special treatment. But the government was done playing games. They transferred him to Alcatraz, the inescapable island fortress. There, Capone was no longer the king of Chicago. He was just another prisoner, stripped of his power, trapped behind iron bars. His mind began to unravel. Years of untreated syphilis rotted his brain. He talked to himself, forgot his own name, and hallucinated imaginary friends. By the time he was released in 1939, he was a shadow of the ruthless crime lord he once was. He spent his final years in Florida, demented, confused, and powerless. On January 25, 1947, at the age of 48, Al Capone died of a stroke and pneumonia. He had ruled Chicago with fear and violence, but in the end, his empire crumbled, his name tarnished, and his enemies victorious. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre marked the beginning of the end for organized crime's golden age. Gangsters were no longer untouchable. The massacre had pushed law enforcement to crack down harder on criminal empires. Valentine's Day was forever stained with blood. What was once a holiday of romance now carried a dark, brutal history. No one was ever convicted for the massacre. Despite overwhelming suspicion, despite the bodies left rotting in a pool of blood, the case remained unsolved. Chicago moved on, but the ghosts of the past never truly disappeared. The garage at 21-22 North Clark Street was eventually demolished, but some places never let go of their history. For decades after the massacre, strange stories began to surface. Visitors reported phantom gunshots echoing in the night, the sound of men screaming in agony, and a cold, eerie presence lingering in the air. Some claimed to see shadowy figures standing where the men were executed. Others swore they felt an unnatural chill in the exact spot where the blood had soaked into the ground. Even today, Valentine's Day brings whispers of the massacre, a reminder that love isn't the only thing that lingers on February 14th. The site of the massacre is now a parking lot, but the legend never faded. In the end, the St. Valentine's Day massacre wasn't just a moment in history. It was a warning, a reminder that power never lasts forever, and that revenge always has a price.